Up next, former House Speaker Newt Gingrich. Speaker Gingrich. How are you, sir? Welcome to Iowa.
Good to be here.
Thank you.
Terry, good to be back.
Being here.
Speaker, you spent some time in the classroom as a professor. The U.S. economy has 6 million fewer jobs today than it did 4 years ago. 2 million of those, a third, have disappeared from manufacturing, from this one sector. Yet many manufacturers report not being able to fill advanced manufacturing positions. How do you begin to address that skills deficit?
You attach a mandatory training requirement to all unemployment compensation. And you say, if you need unemployment compensation, fine, but you have to sign up for a business-offered job training program. If you had 99 weeks of unemployment, that's the associate degree. In 99 weeks, you could train virtually anybody. You establish the principle, we do not give people money for doing nothing.
Where does the funding come from for the training?
You go to the businesses. You say to every business in this country, we're going to provide you free personnel. You can offer distance learning. You look at the University of Phoenix, you look at Kaplan, you look at what the National Association of Manufacturers has done with distance learning. But you say to people, if you took the amount of time we have paid people to do nothing for the last 6 years, you would have the highest human capital in the world in the American workforce. Now, you combine that, as I do at newt.org, with 100% expensing for all new equipment, so you could write it off in 1 year. And you'll now have the most modern manufacturing equipment in the world with the best trained workforce in the world. And at that point, you tell the Chinese that you know they have a crisis and you'll try to counsel them.
What's the direction of American wages at that time? And what's the direction of American wages at that time, and what does that do to the competitiveness for manufacturers?
If you have the best trained workforce in the world with the most modern equipment in the world, wages go up because your productivity goes up. You know, there's a study that just came out of the Boston Consulting Group, and I think it's in August, that says by 2015, South Carolina and Alabama will be less expensive than coastal manufacturing in China if you take total cost. Because it's not just what do you pay the person, but it's what's the cost of the equipment, what's the cost of logistics, what's the cost of all the other factors. There's no reason we can't rebuild America at a remarkable speed. We've done it before, you know, but we have to have a totally new attitude in Washington. And frankly, as the governor knows, in states, in local communities, I mean, we're not going to remain the post-World War II America coasting because we're so dominant. We're going to have to go through a period of very fundamental change in our policies and in our institutions.
To that point, let me ask you about long-term unemployment. Apologies, Governor, but I need to follow up here. Long-term unemployment, almost 40 to 50% of people who are unemployed today have been unemployed for 6 months or longer. Is that a structural economic issue? In other words, is there something structurally wrong with the U.S. economy that people are not able to find jobs?
Yeah, look, there's something very structurally wrong with the U.S. economy. It's called the U.S. government. I mean, when you have a Food and Drug Administration which cripples your ability to bring new products to market, you have an Environmental Protection Agency that runs around Iowa trying to convince farmers there shouldn't be dust on dirt roads. You have, and driving up the price of electricity everywhere in America. You have an anti-petroleum and anti-coal administration in the richest country in the world for energy. You have a tax code which is anti-manufacturing. You have a labor department which is anti-manufacturing. You have a National Labor Relations Board that wants to put Boeing out of business in South Carolina. I mean, go down the list. This country has been maniacally anti-jobs. Obama is a left-wing radical who believes in class warfare, and then he's surprised that everybody who he's attacking doesn't create jobs. What did he think was going to happen? I mean, you can't go around the country and blame everybody who creates jobs and then say, now, gee, why don't you go out and take the risk with your capital and spend the next 5 years of your life creating jobs so I can attack you even more?
As governor, and there's a whole lot of new Republican governors that came in across the upper Midwest, we've been working to reduce the tax and regulatory burden, bring jobs to our states, but we've been hearing concerns that, well, the tax burden at the federal level, and the regulatory burden, you've already talked about the regulatory burden, but that federal corporate income tax and the penalty for bringing profits back from overseas is causing a lot of American companies to say, maybe we ought to just move our whole operation to Canada or some other foreign country instead of investing and creating jobs here. What would you do about that?
Well, I mean, first of all, your analysis is exactly right. And by the way, here, you had a great year with the budget. I mean, you've done a great job of getting Iowa back on track again. And if Washington were doing as well as you're doing, we'd all be at 4% unemployment and happy as we could be. One, you should repeal Dodd-Frank immediately. It is killing small banks. It is killing small business. It is killing housing. 2, you should repeal Sarbanes-Oxley. I just had a major multinational say to me they'd love to be headquartered in the U.S. It would cost them 2% of gross sales for compliance. And Sarbanes-Oxley produces no useful information, produced none in 2008. 3, I think you've got to look at a fundamentally new tax code. At newt.org and our proposed 21st century contract with America, I'm for zero capital gains tax, which would bring hundreds of billions of dollars back in the U.S. and would mean zero capital gains tax also at the corporate level. I am for eliminating double taxation of dividends. I'm for a 12.5% corporate tax rate, which is the Irish tax rate, which would liberate, I think, about $700 billion of the $1.2 trillion that's currently locked up overseas. As I said earlier, I'm for 100% expensing of new equipment, abolishing the death tax, and an optional 15% flat tax on the Hong Kong model, where they have for years now allowed you either to keep the current deductions or go to a flat tax, and they found it to be a very successful model to let people make the choice.
Mr. Speaker, on the repatriation of U.S. company money overseas, would you put any limitations on how those corporations use that money?
No. I mean,
buybacks, dividends, salaries.
What do you care?
Bonuses.
I mean, if they bring $700 billion back to the U.S. and they do it as buybacks, okay, that means they gave all that money to Americans to do something with. I mean, why would you want some Washington politician or Washington bureaucrat setting moral judgments about how independent private firms spend money they've earned?
That money, of course, was made by those American companies due to trade. We have a question about trade from our audience today, in fact, from our host, Mary Andringa. Mary?
Speaker Gingrich, many of us, in fact, most of us in manufacturing have been waiting 4 years to see the 3 free trade agreements passed. We're grateful they finally passed, and the President signed them about a week and a half ago. But meanwhile, our competitors globally in the EU and China are working on a lot of agreements, and I think we now are working on one other one. What would you do as president to move the process along and to open up more markets for U.S. companies?
Well, Mary, let me say, first of all, your company is a perfect example of why you have to have dynamic scoring. In 1948, this company was 1 person. Now it's thousands. If you look at how free enterprise works, over time it does dramatically better than in a snapshot. It's one of the great problems in Washington is having people who score as though the world were a series of Polaroid snapshots, when in fact the world is dynamic and constantly changing. I think we should very aggressively try to have the most open markets in the world. Iowa is a perfect example, not only in agriculture, where if we didn't export, you'd have a depression in prices, right, but also in terms of manufacturing, where you're a dramatically bigger manufacturing state than people realize. But in addition, what I'm outlining is, if you have a revitalized America where you have real training for workers, you have real tax advantages for manufacturing, you have a real effort to modernize the entire basic structure, you have a commitment to American energy, and then you take part of the royalties from American energy and use that as a commitment to infrastructure. The combination of those steps mean we would be once again the most dynamic country in the world, and therefore every trade agreement would be to our net advantage, because we would be a much more aggressive competitor. I think that also means you look at the current taxes on Americans working overseas, because the truth is every American who represents us overseas represents additional jobs in the U.S., and we ought to make it advantageous to be selling America around the world, not a liability to be selling America around the world. And that's why I thought when President Obama went to Brazil and told the Brazilians he was glad they were drilling offshore, and he wanted America to be their best customer, I thought he had it exactly backwards. We don't hire presidents to go out and be foreign purchasing agents. We hire presidents to go out and be salesmen for the United States.
To that end, Mr. Speaker, do you support the 3 free trade agreements that were recently signed?
Yes, I strongly supported all 3 free trade agreements.
Where else would you like to sign free trade agreements under a Gingrich administration?
Look, I would like to get the most wide open markets, which also means, frankly, re-engaging the European Union. The European Union, as they just did with an aircraft tax, for example, the European Union has layers of bureaucracy in Brussels, which is where I wrote my dissertation. And they have layers of bureaucracy that scheme every morning for ways to rig the game against the United States. The Europeans have reached a conclusion they cannot compete with us head to head. and therefore they will try to avoid it by a wide range of regulatory, antitrust, and other devices. And we should be dramatically more aggressive. I'd like to look around the country. I'm not normally pro-trial lawyer, but I would like to look around the country and find the toughest, most energetic trial lawyer in America, make them U.S. trade representative. And tell them their job is to go out and kick in doors for the United States every day, and the more doors they kick in, the happier we're going to be.
What would your policy be? You know, we're still heavily dependent on foreign oil. What would your energy policy be for the United States? How do we become energy independent and reduce the stranglehold that the Middle East and so many of these other countries have on us? And how quickly do you think we could become energy independent?
I think we would be energy independent much more rapidly if we abolished the Department of Energy, which has failed totally for over 30 years, fundamentally reformed the Bureau of Land Management, fundamentally reformed the Department of the Interior, adopted a policy that said pretty straightforward, this country has more total energy than any other country in the world. More than Russia, more than Saudi Arabia, more than Canada, more than China. Massively more. Here in Iowa, 20% of the electricity comes from wind. Right. Okay, I voted for Gasohol in 1984. I voted when Ronald Reagan signed it, and we did it deliberately. We decided that it was better for money to go to Iowa than to Iran, better for money to go to Saudi Arabia, to South Dakota than to Saudi Arabia. I still believe that, and I'd like to see some kind of encouragement for every vehicle to have flex fuel capabilities, and every gas station to be a fuel station, not just a gas station. Now, having said that, I'm for drilling offshore. I am for the development of natural gas. I am for the use of coal, and I would encourage the development of green coal, carbon sequestration, using that for tertiary recovery in the oil fields. You look at Alaska. You don't have to get tied down in a fight over ANWR. We own 69% of Alaska. That's 1.5 Texases. I said this the other day to Governor Perry. Said, I don't want to offend you, but Alaska is more than twice the size of Texas. If you set aside half of Texas, you said to the environmentalists, you get to take half of Texas and Alaska. Tell us the half you love most. That leaves you a state area the size of the state of Texas to develop. Largest coal reserve in the United States is in Alaska. The Chukchi Sea, not ANWR, the Chukchi Sea off Alaska has as much oil and gas as the Gulf of Mexico. I mean, it has taken a maniacally anti-American energy bureaucracy, a truly stupid litigation system, and a president who routinely attacks American industry to keep us from being energy independent. There is zero reason we couldn't create millions of new jobs, hundreds of billions of dollars of net income for the United States, and do so in a way which, by the way, really builds up manufacturing. Because if you're going to develop oil, gas, et cetera, you have an entire manufacturing base providing the equipment to do it.
Mr. Speaker, with those kinds of ideas and with renewable tax credits for renewable energy, ethanol subsidies, what role does the federal government play, in your mind, about supporting research and development when it comes to energy policy and, quite frankly, picking winners and losers?
Let me make a distinction. I think there's a big role for the National Science Foundation, the National Institutes of Health. When I was Speaker, while we were balancing the budget, we doubled the size of NIH. We should have, in retrospect, tripled the size of the National Science Foundation. If you're talking about basic research, the U.S. government is enormously important. If you're talking about encouraging the development of certain activities, it's legitimate, this goes all the way back to Adam Smith and the Wealth of Nations, it's legitimate to have biases in the system in favor of what you want, whether it's building the Transcontinental Railroad by giving away land, or it's by developing airlines by paying for postal air services. I mean, there are a lot of things you can do that don't pick winners and losers. They create an environment and they say to everybody, go out and compete. This is where we want you to go. Now go compete and do this. But we want to have an attitude, I think, that says the federal government does basic research. If you're going to have a tax credit, frankly, it ought to be for at least 10 years because you want a long enough time horizon that people make capital investments. When Congress passes 1-year and 2-year tax credits, it is a tremendously inefficient way to subsidize something because you never get any capital investment and any momentum because you have no planning horizon. And this is why we need.
That's the problem right now with the wind energy tax credit.
Yeah, exactly.
Senator Grassley and others would like to see it extended 4 years. Would you support that?
I would like to see a minimum 10-year tax credits with a rolling annual renewal like football coaches. Okay? I mean that's a pretty good model to keep people focused. But having said that, my candidacy more than anything else is about the scale of fundamental change it takes to rebuild America. And you can take this as one example. I tell everybody, I don't ask anyone to be for me, I ask them to be with me. And the difference in part is we're going to have to spend 8 years reminding Congress every day that petty, parochial committee behavior is destructive of the United States. Passing an annual tax credit is really good for the leverage of that committee and really stupid for America. And I think as a former Speaker of the House, I have a unique standing to explain the legislative process to the legislators. And as president, I would seek to fundamentally change the current congressional behaviors, which I think are destructive to the United States on a bipartisan basis, because they maximize the selfish power of the legislators and minimize the general interest of the country.
Mr. Speaker. We'll leave it there, sir. Our time has run out. Thank you very much. We'll have you stay right there for the time being.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.